So welcome everyone. Tonight's policy and practice seminar is on how rising market power affects the lives of all of us. This seminar series is organized by the Political Science Department at UCL. I'm Michela Tincani, an assistant professor in the Economics Department at UCL. And our subject tonight could not be more topical. Increasing market power can make many of us poorer by increasing prices and also keeping wages stagnant for some of us. And here in the UK, if you read the news, you'll see that the cost of living crisis is on the front pages of most newspapers. It's making headlines daily. And it's clear that there are also important implications for inequality. That's because families whose wages have been more stagnant will struggle more as prices increase. And in fact, tonight we will touch on these topics. We'll touch on the implications of market power for labor markets and for economic inequalities and beyond. So I'm joined tonight by Jan Eeckhout, Eeckhout Research Professor in the Department of Economics at Pompeu Fabra University. Jan is also Vice President of the European Economic Association and Fellow of the Econometric Society and of the European Economic Association. In his research, Jan has made groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of and measurement of market power, and also to our understanding of how labor markets work. Jan has also written a book, The Profit Paradox: How Thriving Firms Threaten the Future of Work, in which he analyzes the causes of the recent rising market power and its consequences for workers and for consumers, and indeed for all of us. About the format of tonight's seminar, Jan will talk for 25-30 minutes. We will then have a discussion between us in the panel for 15-20 minutes before opening the discussion up to Q&A. So let me now invite Jan to start. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michela. Let me share my screen. It's a great pleasure to be back at UCL. But it's also a great pleasure to talk in front of this group on the policy and practice seminar. I'm particularly excited to learn what people think about the topic, and also I think there's going to be interesting questions and debates in the Q&A session from the perspective of policy. I'm going to focus some of what I'm going to be talking about today on the policy and politics implications. And in fact, I'm going to argue that one of the problems is that policy and politics is often too much intertwined with big business. But before I get there, let me try and introduce what the profit paradox is. And I'm going to use a parallel from policy really. Think about the education world. And if one kid bullies another one, then one kid suffers. And if a teacher doesn't care in the classroom, then 20 kids suffer. But when a whole education system is broken, then millions suffer. And today I want to talk about a system that's broken. And to find out what system that is, let me take you back a couple of years when I met with my friend Alex. This was in the United States before the pandemic. And I meet up with him at a bar. And as we meet, I ask, how are you doing? How's life in Silicon Valley? How are things going? And he's really looking down and says, not very good. In fact, it's going so bad that I'm moving out. I'm stopping to try and start a new business. I'm giving up on being an entrepreneur, and I'm moving out. And as he explains the details of what exactly had happened to him, we see on the TV screens the news reports of the Dow Jones, then it was reaching 25,000. And so we see this news report and we hear the anchor saying, this is an amazing sign of how well the economy is doing. This is a sign that really we have a healthy economy. And, Alex says, well, not for me. This is not what I have experienced. This was not the case for me. And as we talk, in fact, also the bartender who brings us a couple of beers says, even for me, I've been doing this job in this bar since 2004. And the wage I take home today is exactly the same as I took home back then. So I haven't seen any wage growth. So the big question is really, and this is the paradox, how come that on the one hand, we see these very successful firms with amazing stock market valuations, much higher than we've ever seen them before. And at the same time, people like the bartender and my friend Alex, the entrepreneur, they don't see any of that. And this is really what the paradox is about. And it's about a system that I believe is broken. And the system that's broken is that there's actually not enough competition in this market. These firms that we see on the stock market reaching extreme high valuations, this is, first of all, a small number of firms. The Dow Jones is only 30 firms. And even the S&P 500, well, it's only 500 firms. And in fact, our research shows that there's only about a few hundred firms that are dominant, that are large, but there's few of them because, you know, the total number of firms worldwide is estimated to be around 100 billion. And we're talking really about only 300 or 400 firms that dominate the market. And the reason why they dominate is not necessarily because they create value, which they also do, and I'm going to talk more about that, but because they create such high valuations because they make enormous profits. And the reason why they make such enormous profits is because they don't have much competition in their market. And so let's try and analyze a little bit further where this is coming from, but let me start with the facts. I'm going to show you here the evolution of the Dow Jones. This is the Dow Jones adjusted for inflation, so it's something like the real Dow Jones, if you want, since the Second World War. And what's the evolution of the Dow Jones? The evolution of the Dow Jones is such that until the 80s, we see not much of an increase. In fact, by 1981, the value of the Dow Jones in real terms was the same as it was in 1945. But then things start to change, and we see that this index from 1980 onwards starts to rise enormously, and especially in the last decades after the Great Recession. And now, you know, we're at close to 35, 36,000. We probably reach 40,000 at some point soon. And now, what is exactly going on? Well, first of all, you know, if a firm has a high stock market valuation, it really means that it's very profitable because investors are willing to pay for a firm because eventually they're going to return some of the money that they're making to the investors.
Sorry to interrupt, Jan, but we cannot see the slides. Are you moving through the slides right now?
I am, yes. So let me try and see. Can you see them now?
It looks all black.
Can you see this?
No. Also, it's not in presentation mode.
Let me stop sharing and let me share again. Thanks for calling it out. I saw my slide changing, but that wasn't helping very much. Let's see this. Can you see my non-maximized presentation mode now?
We can only see it looks all okay. Now we can see the first slide.
You see the first slide? Can you see the graph now?
We just see one data point.
Yes, and basically what I showed you was the evolution. Okay, yes. Thank you, Michaela. Thanks for alerting me to that. So basically, what I just showed is the evolution of the Dow Jones. Nothing happens really until 1980. That in real terms, Dow Jones didn't go up. In fact, by 1981, it had exactly the same value in real terms. And then there was this enormous rise. So what does that mean for the economy? Well, what it means for the economy, we can use the firm as an example by looking at what happens to a firm, because what a firm does really is divide its value that a firm creates, its value added, between what goes to workers, i.e. payroll and wages, what goes to machines, really investments. It doesn't have to be machines. It could be intangibles. It could be software, and whatever's left over is profits. And in 1981, the typical firm, and this is basically the average of all firms, took away a 2% profits. Now, what has happened since then is we've seen these profits and that profit share increase up to 14% in 2019. Now, this is really telling us something about what's going on at the firm level and at the economy level. And this is not just for all firms, by the way, because these 14% of the profits are typically concentrated in these small number of dominant firms. So there's a number of firms that have huge profits. In fact, they have profits that are much higher than what they pay out in wages and what they pay out in investments. And then, in fact, some of the smaller firms don't have that high level of profits. In fact, they have lower profits than they had 4 decades ago. Now, I was talking about the story of my friend Alex, who's moving out of 2 years ago, who was moving out of Silicon Valley. His story is not just the story of one person. his story is a little bit sad in the sense that he developed a software that was peer-to-peer communication that was facilitating it for mobile devices. And it was a new technology that was, allowing basically to have a wider coverage of mobile communications. And some of the big mobile device producers got interested in, talked to him about the takeover, were even drawing up contracts. And in the end, they backed down. They backed down because the engineers had enough information and developed it themselves. And this is one example. What we see is that a startup like his never made it to fruition. And we see that in the data, because if you look at the data in the late 70s, the number of startups was close to 14% of all firms. Now, if you see the evolution, of course, you'll say, this is the digital age. The digital age that starts in the late 70s, this is the time of startups. I mean, if you talk about Silicon Valley, you talk about startups. Now, if you look across the economy, that's not the case, because what happens to the number of startups is that the startups have, in fact, fallen and have fallen to below 8%. So that's nearly half the number of firms that are startup firms. Why is this important? This is important because startup firms are typically firms that grow faster. So young firms grow faster. They do that because they hire more. And on top of that, they innovate more. Now, this is important because the startups are really the building blocks of the economy. And if you have less startups, you have less of these building blocks, less of these dynamic firms in your economy. And that shows, and we will see some of these consequences. I also talked about, the bartender who was complaining, or not complaining, or pointing out that the wages of that kind of jobs had not increased. What I'm going to show you here is that, again, also that is not a story of one person, that this is really a statistic that we see in the entire economy. I'm going to show you the productivity. So that really means how much does a worker on average produce. Okay, and so we think of this as the whole of GDP per worker. That's our measure of productivity. And then I'm going to show you a series of wages. It's not the wages of everyone. It's the wages of around 90% of the population, people who do production and service work. Like the bartender, it will exclude managers, it will exclude CEOs of companies. And what we see is that, again, from the 40s onwards, after the Second World War, wages were co-moving with productivity. But from 1980 onwards, wages started to stagnate. And they started to stagnate. And again, this is for a large fraction of the economy. This is for 90% of all the workers. Productivity kept growing, but wages did not. And I'm going to show you that this is closely related to this rise of the market power. This is one of the big consequences of the rise of market power. Now, there's more than just this wage stagnation. There's also inequality. What I'm going to show you here is the evolution of something similar, the evolution of wages for 4 groups. Groups that I'm going to divide into those with high school or less, so high school and high school dropouts, those with 2 years of college, those with 4 years of college, and those with longer degrees, so master's degrees, PhDs, medical doctors, and things like that. And again, what you see, the evolution of that wage, which is normalized to 1 in the first year, which is 1963, what you see with this evolution is that initially this is moving kind of in unison, and then from the mid-80s, it's starting to diverge. And what do we see as a final outcome? Well, we see that these 4 categories are much further apart from each other. There's, of course, the ones with longer degrees, more than 4 years, they've done better. And this is something we know, that the wage growth of those at the top, the most educated, has gone up substantially. It's gone up about around 45%. But even those with 4 years of college, they've seen much less of a growth. They've seen a growth of around 15%. And those with 2 years of college, their wages have not changed. In fact, they have slightly dropped. And the shocking part is that those with high school degrees and dropouts, their wages are now lower than they were in the 80s. And this is something that is striking for the following reason, that if you think about, a competitive market, when economists say a labor market is competitive, then basically as a worker, you get paid what you produce. You get paid your marginal product. This seems to suggest if markets were competitive, then workers would be paid their marginal product, and therefore they would actually become less productive. And I think it's hard to believe that workers now are less productive. Even the lowest skill type job has improved in productivity because we have better monitoring devices. We have, GPS technology for drivers. Driving a truck is probably not so different now than it was a long time ago, but there's monitoring, there's better ways of making the loads efficient and things like that. So there's even technological progress for these lowest skill jobs. And this seems to suggest that in competitive markets, this is not the case. And I argue that the reason why we see these wages drop is not because their productivity has dropped, because the share rather that they get from this output has dropped. And why has this dropped? Because of these dominant firms. So there's this relationship between these dominant firms having market power, setting prices that are too high, and this has implications for wages and wage inequality, as you can see here. There's one other fact which people sometimes like to call business dynamism. And one measure of business dynamism is the job reallocation. What is the job reallocation? It's basically the percentage of jobs that on average in the firms are turned over. That could be hirings, promotions, that could be firing. And so this used to be in the early 80s around 35%. So 35% of all jobs were turning over. Now, what has happened since then? What has happened is that since the 1980s, this has started to fall, especially since the 90s, and this has fallen from 35% to 25%. And this tells us something about the extent to which that there is this business dynamism, the extent to which firms are actually adjusting to new situations in the market. And this can be related to market power through something that we call pass-through or incomplete pass-through. And what is that? That means that if you're a competitive firm, you have two gas stations at an intersection. If the oil price drops, you have to drop your price, because if you don't, your competitor will do. And this is really highly competitive. So any changes in the costs are going to show up in changes in the prices. But if you're the only one and you have only the next gas station, 20 miles away, then you might not lower your price that much, because there's going to be a lot of drivers who say, okay, this is priced too high, but I'm not going to drive 20 miles to get petrol. And so the amount of competition is really something that affects the extent to which you see costs translating into prices and into hiring, for example. And what we see here is that because more firms are dominant, we see less of this adjustment, and therefore we see less adjustment in the jobs as well. Sometimes people say, what you talk about is a phenomenon that's typical for the United States, because this is a phenomenon that we see, with the big tech companies. The first thing I want to say is, well, it's not just the big tech companies. We see this also in textiles. By the way, Amazon is not a tech company, at least strictly speaking, because it's a retail company. But also we see it in the beer industry, we see it in publishing, we see it in many different areas. And this is not just something that is in the tech industry. It may be the case, and there's increasing research that shows that tech has something to do with it, even in the traditional sectors. So if it's a textiles firm, a traditional sector, but it really heavily uses artificial intelligence and tech, that this has an implication for the market power that we see. But it's not just the fact that something is going on in the United States. Here I'm showing you a measure that is telling us how much market power firms have. This is the market. This is really the price compared to the cost of producing something. So if a firm has a market that starts here on the screen at 1.1, that means that they charge 10% more than what it really costs them to produce whatever they sell. And what we see over time is that this markup has been increasing. This is true in the United States, in North America. It's true around the world, because it's true in Europe, it's true in Asia. Okay. This is something that happens to firms everywhere around the world. This is not something that's exclusive to the United States. And moreover, one side remark on this is that this is coming really from not so much where these firms are, because these firms are global. Everyone is using the apps from Google and Facebook around the world. And really the key question is not so much where the firm is, but where the customer is. And if the customers are using these highly priced goods, then that really means that that's where the market power resides. It's where the customer is. Now, the first thing you say is, I don't pay for my Google apps. I don't pay for Facebook. And that's true. And it makes it even more complicated to make the case towards the public at large, but also to make it the case towards politicians, towards judges who make decisions on whether there is a case for antitrust. Because of course, if a company like Google sells their app for free, they give it to you for free. In fact, you're basically, you're the seller typically, because you're giving away your data. They're using your data, which they then sell on, or they use your eyeballs that they sell advertising for. And in a competitive world, maybe you would not get money from Google, but they might offer you content. And this is something that happens to TV channels. Google might say, I get your data, I offer you the free app, but in exchange for your data, I'm going to really give you some content. I'm going to give you a Netflix subscription for free, for example. And we don't see that. And that's where the market power is, even of these firms for whom the prices are zero. So there's a number of facts here. There's a number of things that we've seen in terms of the evolution of market power and the consequences for the labor market, for entrepreneurships and startups, for the economy as a whole. And so now the question is, where does this come from? What is the origin? What is the cause of this? And there's multiple causes, and there's quite a lot of debate about this, but the predominant source of this is fast technological change. And fast technological change here is, in the movie of the economy, is both the hero and the villain. It's the hero because fast technological change gives us new tools, new things that make life easier, new vaccines, new apps that allow us to go from one place to the other, that tell us how we get there. And this is really the innovation that's the hero part, that improves the quality of life and the value in the economy. But many of these technologies are also used as a villain, in the sense that these technologies are used at the same time to keep out competitors, to avoid or to make sure that competitors cannot enter and compete into this market. And this is also, from a purely technological viewpoint, the fact that there are things like economies of scale, as we call it. So it's really beneficial to be big. There are what we call network externalities, that it's good to have a lot of people together. Let me give you the example of a company like eBay, which is a platform. And it was started in the 1990s. And then that was the hero part, because this was a new technology we didn't have before. You could buy anything from a used book to, a broken pen, and you can buy and sell whatever you wanted. But as you can see, this is what these platforms are: network goods, in the sense that I want to be, as a seller, on a platform where there's a lot of buyers. And I, as a buyer, want to be on a platform where there's a lot of sellers. And so I want this to be big. And it doesn't really pay in terms of, efficiency to have two platforms next to each other. And this is what we've seen. A company like Yahoo Auctions has been trying to come into this market, and they've never been able to. They never got a foot in the door, so to speak, because, well, all the customers are on the eBay platform. What happens, therefore, is that eBay charges for each transaction 6 or 7 or 8%. And even when Yahoo Auctions was saying, I'm going to compete at lower prices, that is, I'm going to charge only 0.5%, customers wouldn't move. Why are customers there irrational? No, they're not, because they have this trade-off. Yes, they prefer to pay 0.5% as a fee, but they would rather be in a market where there's a lot of buyers and sellers together. And that's this network effect, that wants the product that you're selling, or the market that you're selling, to be really very dense. And this creates economies of scale, and this creates basically the ability to create a monopoly without having competition in this market. Now, this is not something that is completely new. We've seen that also in the past. I mean, if you go back to the 1900s, the turn of the last century, this was the second industrial revolution, and then there was fast technological change too. What we had then was electricity, oil exploration, railway travel. What happened there too was that, there was companies that created enormous economies of scale. It doesn't make sense to have 2 parallel lines of a train running. And people like Rockefeller developed a network goods again, of oil exploration with Standard Oil, that basically became a monopoly. And similar also with the electricities that later on became utilities. It took us a very long time to intervene in these markets. And then the question is, what can we do? Well, first of all, in 1900, it ended up pretty badly, because at that time we also had a negative consequence in terms of lower wages. We also had the negative consequences of having very few small firms and entrepreneurship. And we also had a lot of inequality and polarization. And it ended only after 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And maybe we can do better today to try and think about what this problem is and how we can resolve it. And one way to do it is to really think carefully about ensuring that these technologies that really want to be large, that's where the efficiency comes from. You don't want 2 railway lines next to each other, and you don't want to have 2 platforms that sell secondhand goods next to each other. But what you do want is you want to have competition on these platforms, and that you can regulate. And there's principles like what people from the tech industry call interoperability. That is an idea that you want to really separate the value of the platform, which you want to be large, from the competitors that are on it. Let me give you an example of my phone plan here with Movistar, and I compared it with my phone plan in the United States with AT&T. The AT&T plan costs about 2.5 times for exactly the same service. The technology is the same, 4G, 5G. This network of cell towers is the same. I use the same device. I just change the chip. And so now the question is, why is there such a difference in price between the AT&T plan and the Movistar plan? Well, the reason is because there's
sorry to interrupt again. We're still on the markups slide.
Yes.
Is that?
I'm going to come to the next slide. Sorry. I wasn't.
Oh,
okay. I don't have a slide
intended.
Thanks, okay. Michaela. It's a feature.
Okay.
So where's the difference coming from? The difference is coming from, in fact, I can stop sharing so you can probably see better. Where's the difference coming from between these 2 markets? The US market, which technologically has exactly the same features that the market in Europe. And the reason is this principle of interoperability, and this principle of interoperability really means that as a operator in the market, you own a network of cell towers, by the way, which is extremely expensive to build. And what happens is, if a competitor wants to come in, they have to compete against you by first building this very expensive network. And so the interoperability rule in the market is that if you own a network like that, you're forced to receive competitors on your network against the price. So they have to, pay a rental fee if you want to help you pay for the investment or help you recoup the investment. But the advantage of that is that once you have a smaller firm that wants to come in, they don't have to make this huge investment in building this network, and they can immediately start on your network at virtually no cost. The only cost they have is the rental price, but they don't have the investment cost. And so what we see in these situations is that, of course, smaller firms enter this market. Polish firms can enter into the Dutch market if they want. And this is going to lead to a decline in prices, because what is the Polish firm going to do? It's going to say, well, I want to try and attract customers. How can I do this? By offering the same services at a lower price. And this leads to separation of the operation of the network versus the competition between operating firms that are on the network. And this separation is one example in which we can achieve more competition, but this requires an amount of regulation that has to be administered, if you want, by the antitrust authorities. And I think this is where I guess this type of seminar on policy and practice is relevant here. One of the big problems that we see around the world, both in Europe and in the United States, is that there's a lot of meddling of these dominant firms into the political decision-making process. To give you an example, there is, think of Uber, for example. Uber is spending a lot of money lobbying local authorities to get their network to be available. Now, what we see is that there's a vicious circle, if you want, between the market power that generates profits And then the influence on regulation that says, AT&T doesn't want this interoperability on their networks. They don't want this. And so they lobby the political process in such a way to avoid that this is coming about. If they are successful, they have more market power, create more rents and more profits. If they have more profits, they even have more resources to do this lobbying work and avoid having other regulation that would introduce more competition. So in order to get competition, you also need to be able to separate the dominance, these large firms, which through their dominance have also become extremely wealthy with enormously deep pockets, and that are able to influence the political decision-making process. You have to somehow find a way to separate these two. And I think this is one of the big challenges at the moment, the political challenges. How can we keep the big money out of the political decision-making process? Because in a sense, these large firms, they ideally would like to regulate their own markets, and the regulation of their own markets means not too much competition. In fact, the less competition, the better for the own firm, but this is not good for the customer, and that's how we get these negative consequences. So let me come to a conclusion. Let me just sum up and say the following, that next time if you see a news report about the Dow Jones, it's probably going to be reaching 40,000 at some point. If you see the news report, think twice because this is probably not necessarily a sign that we are in a healthy economy. Even the anchor is probably going to say that, ringing the bell and great news and things like that, but it's probably not going to be a sign of a healthy economy, because we know that this leads to wage stagnation, that it stifles innovation, and then ultimately leads to inequality and polarization. And we see not only polarization in the economic terms, but also we see polarization in social terms, which lead to political polarization, which is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we face today. And we've seen in the past that resolving this or letting this be resolved by itself is not necessarily going to be a very peaceful way to do that. And I think we have a responsibility to avoid that. And there's a way in which we can avoid this. There's definitely regulation. We have to separate politics from policy. We have to, and by which I mean we have to keep out the influence of the of these dominant firms and their large amounts of money that they can and do spend on influencing the policy. And that's the way, I think, for example, through interoperability, separating platforms from operators, that generates competition. Ultimately, the objective is, if you have more competition, even in markets where naturally there's a tendency to have monopoly, you can create competition. You can create circumstances and an environment where firms do and want to compete. And if this is happening, what you're going to see is that many of these negative consequences on wages, on startups, on entrepreneurship that we now see that is really affecting the economy negatively can be avoided. And basically we can, have more of these dynamic building blocks of the economy that are driving growth and progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you. That was incredibly interesting. And I have a couple of questions. And by the way, remember that you can submit your questions in the Q&A, and we can discuss them once we open up the discussion. So you say this problem is not going to resolve itself and that we need regulation. But it was on the news today, Meta, former Facebook, lost 200 billion in value. The share price decreased by 20%. And this is due to falling profits, in fact. And Zuckerberg himself ascribed this to the rise of the Chinese competitor, TikTok. So I was wondering, these are global firms where the customer is everywhere. So does that mean that globalization can come to the rescue? So what is the link between globalization and market power or wage stagnation?
I think this is a very good point and a very interesting point. I think that globalization is really part and parcel of the whole dominant firm issue. Why? Because these are firms that are global themselves, they operate globally, so their competitors are going to be global. It's no longer the case that you have your local competitor who is trying to get into your market, for example. Sometimes you hear people talking, and this is what I think is part of the lobbying process. You hear people talk about, we need national champions because we're going to be taken over by Chinese firms. Well, the best thing that can happen is that if we have competing firms, whether they're from China, the United States, or from Düsseldorf, it doesn't matter where they're coming from. As long as there's firms that are competing that are going to lower prices. Again, we have the issue that many of these products don't have prices, but we talked about that before, that there's a tendency, of these competitors to basically increase the quality, or at least the value to the customers, because they get the same goods at lower prices and they get more value. And then we don't see these negative side effects either. So I think rather than going for local or national champions, I think it's much better to have global competitors. Now, we also know that a company like Meta, so let's say Facebook, these networks are now also global networks. So this is also saying that we will need regulation at a global level. It's not going to be sufficient to say we're going to do regulation in the United States and different regulation in Europe and then some different regulation in Australia. We will have to have coordination. I think one good piece of a development has been that in the G7 meeting in May last year, there was a proposal for a very different issue, which was on corporate tax coordination. Well, if there's coordination on these issues, let's also try and think about coordinating on issues like market power and therefore antitrust enforcement and institutions that do that.
Yeah, I think that is, it's a bit optimistic, but there's reason for being optimistic about international collaboration. But talking about, these are global phenomena, you focused on the United States, and I have two questions. One is, it seems like a lot of the patterns you mentioned, so the Dow Jones increasing in value, the increased wage inequality, markups going up, they all started in the 80s. So is there something specific about the 80s in the United States or globally? And then second, what do you think are the main differences between the UK and the US, or Europe and the US?
So differences, there's always plenty, but in broad lines, we see very similar developments actually around the world, at least in let's say kind of the developed economies. I showed you the markups, they're very similar for different countries. There are differences, especially in the consequence. For example, inequality in France hasn't gone up yet, but there's recent work that shows, well, that France is a little bit different, because France, the payroll tax used to be highly regressive in the early 90s, and then it was made linear, and then it was made highly progressive. Now let's calculate inequality of wages in terms of what it costs to the firm, because that's now the relevant comparison, and we see enormous rises in inequality in France. The worker doesn't see it in that inequality in their net income, but that's really because there's a lot of policy behind, and policy can do a lot of good things. So we have to be very careful to come to conclusions and say, this doesn't exist in France, this doesn't exist in other places. That doesn't mean that there's no differences. For example, there's a bit of a puzzle out there in the UK that the labor share hasn't fallen. Everything else is very similar. Markups have gone up, profit rates have gone up, business dynamism has gone down in the UK as it has in the most of the advanced economies, but the labor share hasn't gone down. So there's things that we try to understand, and there's obviously going to be country-specific differences that are going to play always. But broadly speaking, I think it's a global phenomenon. It's something that's going on globally. And then why the 1980s? It's very easy to say 1980, that's Reagan, right? And even Thatcher in the UK. True, and for sure some of this has played in it, because there was a change in the way antitrust and merger review was conducted. And so there were changes in policy. But then at the same time, when did the digital age start? And that was the late 70s, early 80s. And that's really when we see this fast transformation in how businesses do business. And the fact that we see these markups go up also in Germany, also in Italy, also in Norway, there wasn't a Thatcher there and there wasn't a Reagan there. And so many of these developments, I believe, are driven to a large extent by fast technological change. That doesn't mean that policy didn't have anything to do with it, but I think it's really the big driver that starts in 1980 is this fast technological change with the digital age.
Jan, perhaps in great talk, like quick question exactly to that point, because this digital transformation, that really fits nicely to Google, to Amazon, and most of the examples you talked about. But at the very beginning of your talk, you talked about drinking a beer, right? And even beer making got more concentrated, and profits are rising in very traditional businesses. So do you have like an idea of why profits are kind of rising across the board, also in industries that seem very far away from digital technologies?
Well, Ralph, I think probably the beer industry is probably the best example where merger review has been very lax and antitrust enforcement has been very lax. And notice that if an Amazon has grown from the mid-90s from nothing to what it is now, it virtually has not done any M&A activity. They have bought companies, but for what the value of its companies, it's peanuts. AB InBev, which is the biggest beer brewer in the world, has grown exclusively through mergers and acquisitions. And I think that this is the best example where lax policy, played a role. On their end, AB InBev, they argue that there's also something different about this technology, and there seems to be also some returns to scale there. And this is going through either the demand side, through the brands. These are now global brands. Before, we had our beer that was all very local, and now these brands are global, and that seems to say something about returns to scale. And then the networks of distribution seem to have also some returns to scale, and that may indicate that it's lax policy, but kind of helped by some scale economies as well. But again, there's definitely many different forces going on. I would say the predominant one is the one with the digital age and fast technological change.
One more quick question on policy, because we talked a lot about like merger and acquisitions, basically on regulation and antitrust policy. But kind of the textbook policy you would do in case of monopoly power would be subsidies, right? Would be subsidies for the monopolists to produce more, would be subsidies for startups. So do you also have some kind of new ideas of how to do policy in this kind of world?
I mean, one of the things we see with the policy, the taxation / subsidy policies, is that they can definitely improve things like wage stagnation. They can improve, if you subsidize young and startup firms, you can improve entry of those firms into the market. But, we've done work on that. You cannot solve the root cause. And the only way to solve the root cause is to deal with this, network effect, to deal with these economies of scale. And the only way you can do that is regulation that goes directly at that. The taxation helps definitely in soften the sharp edges, but it doesn't, give you a solution that improves and resolves the problem. And I think that's, of course, we will never have the antitrust policy that's going to be the ideal policy that resolves these issues. So we will always need a combination of taxation and subsidies. But I would like to argue that there's much more we can do now on antitrust to affect inequality, to affect wages, to affect business dynamism, which is somewhat contradictory, which is kind of a paradox. Why would you have an effect on wages by antitrust policy? Okay, and I think that's in my view the new insight that we have to take on board. When I talk to people who are in practice, they say, the laws now, they're not ready to do that. And the way I see it is that everyone is, when there's an antitrust case, there's a wave coming, maybe it's a big wave, and everyone sits there with their surfboard and they try to, ride the wave, and that's how they do antitrust. And you have very good people looking at that. But it seems that at the moment we have a tsunami going, because there's so many different things going on at the same time. And then looking at these waves is not going to make any difference. And trying to deal, ride those waves is not going to help you understand what's going on. You really want to deal with this enormous flood of firms that have market power, and everyone in practice in antitrust says exactly that. If we get 100 cases coming in, we immediately discard 90 because it's too small or the effects are not large. Then we look at 10 kind of so-so, and we do really we litigate one case. And so this is not because they think that there's only 1 in 100 of the cases that have to be litigated. It's just that there's no resources to do that. And I think that's another way where I think policy can make a big difference.
So I think we have a few questions from the Q&A, so we can, perhaps it's a good moment now to open up the discussion, and Abby is going to ask the questions.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with 2. So Mimosa says, very interesting. What does Jan think about the role of the state? For example, in reference to the entrepreneurial state of Mariana Mazzucato, if he knows the book, otherwise just in general. And the second question is from Sari, who says, my question would be about regulating these firms. As you said, the big and most powerful firms are the ones that are competing on a global level. Does this mean we need a new type of global regulation to deal with these types of companies? Thanks.
Thank you, Abby. Yeah, thank you both, Mimosa and Sari, for the questions. Let me start with the second one. We've talked about it a little bit. I think, yes, I mean, ideally, we have to look at a global system. The same way that we have a global system for patents, we have to have, I believe, a global system for dealing with antitrust, because otherwise there's competition to the bottom. I mean, if you want to be hard on some companies, well, they're going to move out, and then you're double the losers. So you lose say the production side or something like that. And it's same with tax competition. That's why we talked earlier about this G7 case. To Mimosa's question on the role of the state, I mean, this is clearly a role for the state. What Mariana Mazzucato proposes, that the state takes these activities in hand. I'm not so convinced about that. I'm not so convinced that it's the state that should do it. I mean, I think what we first and foremost need, for sure, there's certain things that the state can do, but the fact that the BioNTech, the German vaccine that became Pfizer, was basically financed by grant money is a sign that there's things that the state does well and has generated enormously beneficial outcomes. But I think the negative effects that we're seeing, in my view, are all driven by the lack of competition. And the state isn't going to add competition to that. That is the state entering as a firm in there. I like to compare it to playing football. It's you want good rules, and the government has to set the rules. They don't have to put a player. They don't even have to put a referee. Let's take an impartial person who's the referee and make sure that the rules are clear. And if you tackle someone, last person in front of goal, that's a red card. It's you know the rules. There's always going to be contentious debate about what exactly the interpretation of the rule, and you're going to have video arbitrage and whatever you want. But ultimately, the clearer the rules are, let people play. At the moment, we have a playing field that's tilted, where here there's probably 17 players and here there's 3. And of course, there's always one team that wins because they run downhill and they have more players. And that doesn't look like competition. And I think that the type of government intervention is not to become a player. The type of government intervention is to make sure that the playing field is level, that there is a decent chance of competition, that startups have a chance to enter, and then you get these positive effects like countering wage stagnation. You get wages that are going to go up. You do this without, in fact, any intervention in the labor market. You intervene in this, in this goods market where the antitrust issues are. So I beg to disagree. Of course, Mariana Mazzucato is kind of a very powerful and influential intellectual, and she has many important things that are extremely valuable. But on this issue, I beg to disagree.
Great, thank you. So Gordon has 2 questions. He says, what specific legislation would global regulation look like? And are these trends related to the transition from Fordism? Oh, sorry, you're on mute, yeah. Thanks.
Sorry, I said I have to think about the Fordism here. Let me start with, I mean, global regulation. What I would start to do is really think about first with coordination. The same way we coordinate patents, and of course, you know, some countries don't enter the international patent agreements, but it's all about coordination. There seems to be a lot of coordination between European patents and American patents, and one that you know, make it. Let's start with these antitrust policies speak to each other. The type of regulation I think we need most urgently, which is actually on the debate, or that's on the table with the Digital Markets Act in the EU, is about what to do with these platforms, with these network effects. And I think this is probably the most urgent step to take. I would think that it would be best if this was a step that was taken maybe in coordination between the United States and the EU, and then you start from there and you can see if you can get more OECD countries on board. So I would start definitely with platforms and these let's say kind of scale economies that are deriving from the digital age. The transition out from Fordism, I think I'm caught off guard here because I'm you know, if you can help me a little bit, because I you know, let's go back to Fordism. So let's say early 20th century. I mean, sure, maybe in Fordism created, maybe it created these enormous returns to scale. So it was not just, you know, oil exploration, it was not just electricity and railway travel, also these management kind of techniques or ideas to streamline production in large manufacturing plants have led to market power too, because, you know, we needed fewer or there was fewer competitors because there was so much scale. I have the impression that Fordism has become kind of robotism, and that many of these developments have, you know, not affected the workers that much, in the sense that there's obviously labor saving technological progress. But I think it seems that a lot of that is now transitioning towards capital investments that are even higher than they were back then.
Great, thank you. William asks, last year in the UK, a lot of small energy companies went bust when their cost price rose. Should these small companies increase quality and be reassuringly expensive instead of dropping price to grab share? And Bakar asks, is the market power widespread in the service sector as well?
So let me start with the second one. The short answer is yes. We see that the spread of market power measured by profit rates, measured by markups, what I talked about earlier, or even measured by, if it's publicly traded firms, by the market valuation. Market power is widespread in all sectors, not just tech, also traditional sectors and also services. Now, market power is not something that means that all the firms do better. It's about a few firms that do very well in their industry and many others don't. You know, if you think about the service sector, many of the health sectors, which are typically very highly regulated, at least in Europe, you know, there is quite a bit of consolidation and concentration going on there too. There's many different service sectors, for example, you know, low-skilled workers who do cleaning and who do kind of security work, or the stewards in sports events. You know, there's been enormous consolidation and increase in market power also in these sectors. But again, if you had a firm that had, you know, 100 stewards, and you're competing now with a firm, this global international firm that has 500,000 stewards, this is meaning that you're this small company. Well, first of all, the most likely event that will have happened is that they have taken you over. But if this didn't happen, your profits have gone down because they're going to be, you know, able to compete much harder against you. And I think that when we say, is market power widespread? It is widespread in the sense that it exists everywhere, but only a few firms benefit, and most of the firms are actually suffering. I think the question about the small energy companies is similar. I personally think that there's nothing wrong with going bankrupt. I mean, it's part of investing. You know, we want bankruptcy as a kind of a way to adequately price the value of capital ultimately, because you know, you invest in this capital and you want to know there's risk associated with it. You want investors who make the right decision, the best decisions. You want them to be successful and to be rewarded, and the ones who make the mistakes, well, they should pay the consequences for that. And so going bankrupt, I think, is part and parcel of a competitive system, of a market economy. I think we see too little of that, actually. Why? Because we have too little startup firms entering. They don't even enter anymore, so they can't go bust. So they've gone basically, you know, they've gone bankrupt before they even started because they didn't enter. And the large firms, of course, because they're dominant, they sit on such a nice dominant position. They're these castles with a moat around it, as Warren Buffett says. Because they have that big advantage, they really are never going to go bankrupt. I mean, they you know, bad shocks, bad outcomes, they have such a buffer of profits that this is not going to affect them.
Great, and we've got one more question so far. So Matthew says, do you think there's any room for the argument that the problem is the profit motive itself? For example, do you think encouraging more employee ownership among firms could play a role in reducing the imbalance between workers' earnings and productivity?
I mean, this is a very interesting question. It's getting a little bit more philosophical. I think it's you know, it depends on how we want to define the profit motive. I would say the first and foremost problem that we see is the institutions. If there's a technology like building rail lines or like having an eBay platform that gives you enormous returns to scale, there's nothing wrong with inventing this new technology and getting some profit for it. I think there's nothing wrong with entrepreneurs becoming millionaires. The problem is that they become billionaires or trillionaires, and they are like that for a long time. It's not Schumpeterian creative destruction. It's just that they maintain these positions for a long time. So I think per se, there's nothing wrong with the profit motive. It aligns the right incentives to innovate and to make the right the decisions. But institutions are, I think, not adequate to deal with many of the new technologies, and they're not adequate in the sense that they do not dismantle these enormous advantages from scale, and they do not regulate these markets in an adequate way, such that the profit motive is not because you're smart and you're, you know, making the right decisions and you innovate and you make sure that you hedge risk well. You get the profits because you were there first. And then I think we see profit motive going hand in hand with returns to scale or scale economies or having network effects. And it looks like the problem is the profit motive. I think it's more that we have to acknowledge that in general, technologies and markets are not always perfectly functioning. And that there we need a regulation. Again, going back to my football parallel, you know, as long as they run and the playing field is level and there's 11 players on each side, you know, let them compete and let them go for the profits, which means let them win if they play well and if they do better. But at the same time, of course, if we start playing on a not level playing field and if we have different numbers of players on each team, then of course the profit motive is basically adulterated and it causes distortions that we don't want. But I think inherently it's not a problem with the profit motive, it's a problem with the institutions that do not recognize that there is no such thing as a free market. Every market needs some help to be free.
Yeah, and it sounds like the profit motive per se may not be bad, but bad consequences if economic power becomes political power, and then we lose the fairness in the system.
Totally.
A cascade of consequences from that. Okay, so there's no more questions in the Q&A, so we can conclude a little bit earlier today. Before we conclude, let me remind you about the seminar next week. The seminar next Thursday, it will be Joe Mogam QC and Gemma Abbott talking about the Good Law Project and all the different legal challenges they have brought against the government. I would like to thank today's speaker, Jan Eeckhout, for a fantastic seminar. And if you haven't bought the book, do it. It's a great book. And I want to thank Abby and Ralph, and thank everybody for participating.
Thank you, everybody.